Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k Space Marine Let's Play. And when we last left our hero, he was just getting on a Valkyrie in order to make it to the super secret Inquisition weapon, which somehow, when activated, is going to end the Orc menace. Hopefully. Supposedly. So pretty much we're just, on an on-rail shooter at this moment in time. Got a bunch of jetpack and orcs and planes flying around causing mayhem and mischief and essentially going to shoot us down and murder us, which will be very, very sad. So we're just going to, stand here and instead shoot them all forever with our heavy bolter and hopefully save some of our allies in the process, because if you are not aware, we don't have very many left, because when the orcs owned the gun from way, way previously in the game, they shot down pretty much all of the reinforcements. And according to notes that we find and information we glean, it turns out there's only a couple hundred guardsmen left in this area of the city. Do you just call it a city? I'm honestly not sure. When your entire planet is a single city, is it still technically a city? I don't know. I'll leave that one to the philosophers. But yeah, so again, somehow because orcs are here, that gives leave for the Inquisitor to shoot off his weapon, which he said he needed special, dispensation to shoot off. Not sure why this invasion is somehow so important as to allow it. We're just going to let it slide. But I will take this opportunity to start talking about the Inquisition itself, which I've mentioned quite a bit beforehand, but I haven't, gone in depth into the Inquisition and, their thoughts on how to combat chaos. So, if you've ever ended up reading any of the Inquisition books, there are 3 omnibuy that I'm aware of currently, one of which is in Inquisition War, which I have mentioned before as the worst of all the books, and you really shouldn't read it unless, you just want to read some really silly, weird stuff. And then there's Eisenhorn, which follows Eisenhorn as an Inquisitor doing his stuff, and Ravner. Now, I've read Eisenhorn, I have not read Ravner, but Ravner is actually a disciple or apprentice of Eisenhorn during the Eisenhorn series, and then over time, obviously, he becomes a full-fledged Inquisitor, and then the Ravner books just have him being an Inquisitor himself. So, there's 2 main facets to being a Inquisitor, and there's essentially 2 factions, not of course including all the factions of what they focus on, Xenos, Malleus, and all that stuff. And it's essentially how they decide to combat chaos. The first is essentially, the Puritans or the super pure guys who believe that anything having to do with chaos is evil. If you find chaos relics or anything like that, they should be destroyed or, at least, hidden away and never touched. The second group essentially say we should be able to use, any weapon that we can find in order to stop chaos. Now, if that's, of course, within reason. If literally they came across something that was like, if you hold this sword, you're going to turn into a demon prince of chaos, but you can then run around killing chaos like that, most of them would say, no, that's too far because you're quite literally falling to chaos to use it. But if, for example, they come across just a really powerful weapon on a chaos planet, they would say, well, I'll shoot this gun off, who cares, it doesn't matter. And it's worth, the price. Which, ideally, the price being, we're just using this weapon that was on a chaos planet, as opposed to something that, creates chaos. Now, of course, this is great fodder for novels and what have you, and it's very common for, a lot of the Inquisition novels to start off with them, being Puritans, and then needing to, over time, relax their morals a little bit and start using, other weapons, which could be, chaos-infused weapons in order to, complete their objective, whatever that may be. Or if you're in dire straits, to make some small sacrifices. And of course, it can quite easily end with them truly falling to chaos, because all that you need is a little fracture in their will in order for chaos to, seep in and take over. So if I recall correctly, the Eisenhorn novels actually end with him being deemed by Ravner a traitor and fall into chaos. In fact, in the Grey Knights, I can't remember if it's the standalone novel or the omnibus. I think it's the standalone novel. They actually have an Inquisitor who ends up coming face to face with the demon and doing all this weird, bizarre research, and she essentially goes crazy doing it. And then when the Grey Knight shows up to kill her, she then whispers a bunch of unintelligible crap to him, and he ends up killing her. Now, what truly ends up happening is that she whispers to him the true name of a demon, so that he is then able to use it near the end of the book in order to destroy the demon forever. Because true names have power. Nya, 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 nya. Sometimes. Depends on who's writing the books. But so just to be quick on this, because it's gonna, I'm sure some people from earlier are like, what the heck are you talking about? You're a dingus vagina. Well, it turns out, spoiler alert, that Inquisition War was, I believe, written before, they set up proper lore, so a bunch of weird stuff goes on.
Farewell, Captain.
And you end up jumping through a lot of really bizarre sequences of events, and I'm going to be honest, I don't remember all of them, but such things happen as they end up breaking into Earth, and they break into the Emperor's throne room and have the Emperor literally scream into the guy's head because the Inquisitor is trying to follow some huge conspiracy involving some Hydra type group, which is just this huge weird conspiracy that's going on. It also involves one of his squad members or part of his entourage being part of the dedicated Assassins Guild, and she is able to transform herself, and at one point she transforms herself into a gene stealer to then go hang out with a bunch of gene stealers so that she can kill the Tyranid tyrant and essentially stop the gene stealer threat in its tracks. It involves them getting their hands on essentially a space marine who follows them for reasons. They never really make it clear. Like nowadays, they would have, special dispensation for a space marine to go and follow the Inquisition, aka Death Watch. But he just ends up going with the Inquisitor. If I recall correctly, he gets his eye gouged out, and they end up shoving some weird thing into his eye socket so that he can see some invisible map that doesn't really exist, but does exist. And they end up running through a bunch of portals through weird dimensions and planets, and running across giant battlefields involving titans and what have you. And it ends up with him, with the Inquisitor, essentially falling in love with the weird assassin girl, but she gets murdered by a god of, the Eldar. And so then he goes into the warp, or not the warp, he goes into the webway, which is also kind of in the warp, but the webway, if you're unaware, are the pathways that are made by the Eldar that let the Eldar travel through the warp, and he goes through all these weird pathways in the webway, and then tries to conduct a ritual with some weird thing in order to bring her back to life, but it ends up with her going crazy and being resurrected as another Eldar god, and then she kills him. I think it's wild. It's possible that I'm mixing up some of those events in that one with another Inquisition book, which is known as the Atlas Infernal. But if you ever, for some weird reason, and I do not recommend Ian Watson's Inquisition War, I do not recommend you read this, but if you end up reading it, it is just like a bizarre mound of garbage and crap that just makes you baffled, and you sit there and you're like, what the heck is going on? And it tries to deal with all these huge events and themes that are just in the background, and they're never brought up again. As I said earlier, one of the big things is that there is quite literally a huge conspiracy theory going on behind the scenes, which involves, maybe Inquisitors, but also maybe weird Eldar people, but it's involving the end of the world and stuff like that, and then it just gets dropped. It's never brought up again outside that series because it doesn't get talked to, and it gets doubly weird because it ends up They managed to escape the throne of Terra, where the Emperor yells at him. And then they just kind of hide out in the Milky Way galaxy, like just kind of floating in stasis for God knows how long. They quite literally climb into these coolers, which was stasis coolers, and they set a timer to be like, okay, please wake us up in 200 years. So that when, they end up getting woken up, they'll have been forgotten about and they can continue on with their journey, whatever that is. And accidentally their psyker, so they're supposed to go in with and keep their minds blank, like not think of anything, because reasons which I'll kind of get into in a second. So what ends up happening is that they put their psyker in there, because the whole group was in there, but their psyker, for some bizarre reason, can't get out of his mind. Some weird, disgusting, like 600-pound whale of a demon with, 17 breasts, and is this really disgusting, like Slanesh demon. And he ends up thinking of it right before he goes into stasis, and what they end up saying is that the whole time he was in stasis, he was reliving that horrific moment and that horrific memory for the entire 200 years, and that's why you're not supposed to think of anything. You're supposed to keep your mind blank, because whatever you think of is then just gonna somehow get recycled through your mind over and over. So for 200 years, he was having this like horrific nightmare, and so he wakes up, and then he's just crazy. And they're like, yep, turns out our psyker is now just forever useless and crazy. And you're like, oh, okay then. Yeah, it's wild. As I've said earlier, like if you just want to get into Warhammer 40k books, just go wild. Go into your local bookstore or, the Warhammer 40k Lexicanum, and you can just look through all the books. They're all great. And just read something and see anything that pops out at you. Chances are it'll be good. Okay, that's a lie. Let's not say that. Chances are it will interest you. And it won't obviously maintain for the whole time. For example, I started again with the Salamanders, which I thought was quite good. But then over time, I wanted more out of the books. And some books provided that and some didn't. For example, the most generic and the ones that I got tired of quickest were in fact the Space Marine battles, because there's not much you can do with Space Marines, if we're going to be honest. Like there's no growth that you can really get through Space Marines. The most you're really ever going to come across is, them coming to terms with becoming a Space Marine if you start them off there and not as Space Marines already. Or, them learning to command, or, them climbing the ranks. You can't really have, character growth, because it doesn't really work that way. Like, sure, you can have them, like, go from, oh, I'm a brash, space wolf who just wants to run and wreak havoc, to I can temper, my anger. But there's no huge growth opportunities there, which eventually gets disappointing, which is, again, one of the reasons why the Space Marine battles, if that's all you want, is a great series for that, because it's literally just an author picks a random Space Marine chapter, and then they do a battle on a planet, and it can be great or it can be not so great, but you know what you're getting going in. And then when you have authors who do try to make, more from the from their Space Marine chapters, it can be really hit or miss. For example, the Blood Angels, their books are not good. But to be fair, I believe the author is James Swallow. I didn't really like his Sisters of Battle series, and I don't really like his or Blood Angel series either. That one, they pretty much end up just going and showing up, and it's, turns out somehow the Blood Angels are getting corrupted and nobody knows, and it's super secret, and your main guy is finding out that his chapter or his company is corrupted and falling to chaos. And you kind of read that and you're like, well, really? Like, because that's all you can really do. It's either, there's a hidden chaotic threat going on within the chapter, in which case, if the Inquisition ever actually did end up finding out about it, then surprise, your entire chapter is going to get removed. They're just going to kill you all, and there's nothing you can do about it because you're quite literally falling to chaos. So it doesn't work. Or it's, something along the lines of, there aren't very many of us, and, we took huge losses here. For example, the Crimson Fists, I believe, one of their Space Marine novels is actually their, I can't remember what they call the planet where they have their, the planet they recruit from. It has a special name, and unfortunately I can't remember what it is right now. They actually, in one of their Space Marine novels, it's the Orks attacking there, fortress monastery, something like that. And it's pretty much them fighting for their lives and the survival of their entire chapter, which I find really great. But yeah, so when you go with Space Marines, you're not going to get, some huge exciting things. Whereas if you're going with, for example, Imperial Guard, you can quite literally read, a book, and it will just detail an entire unit just getting destroyed and gone forever. An entire regiment just gone forever, just slowly getting ground down to paste, and then they're gone forever. But it's also a lot easier to do with Imperial Guard, because I could take, a Catachan, I don't know how to pronounce it, I'm going to say Catachan, like a Catachan Jungle Fighter unit, and I can kill them all off, which there is one that happens like that, where they end up going, if you're unaware, Catachan Jungle Fighters come from another Death World. Death Worlds are like the highest rated worlds where it's hardest to stay alive, and they're essentially jungle fighters. So anytime there is a planet that has, dangerous jungle, they bring them in to act as guides and to essentially kill, whoever is invading it, because that's their specialty, kind of like the Valhallans specialize on ice worlds. Valhallans aren't a Death World regiment, though, so they do end up going to, like regular planets. But generally, Catachan Jungle Fighters are only they're only brought into, Death Worlds, other jungle Death Worlds, because that's where what their specialty lies in. And they end up, going in to one that, and it turns out the fauna is somehow turning, people into zombies, and they're fighting weird zombie orcs, and then they're also, slowly getting consumed by the forest too, and they generally end up just dying in that one. But it's fine, because you can just raise another regiment of them. It doesn't work with Space Marines, obviously, because each chapter is, again, only roughly 1,000 soldiers strong, and if for some reason they do end up getting wiped out, well, generally that also means their gene seed's gone forever. You can't make them anymore. That chapter is now gone forever. You can't do anything else with them. Which is why anytime they try to raise stakes, especially on really important chapters, and these are like your founding chapters, so your Ultramarines, your Blood Angels, your Salamanders, I believe the Black Ravens were another one. It doesn't work out very well. But yeah, this is a wild part. You'd notice that I did end up dying there, and I got picked up and smashed into the ground. Always fun. So right now, again, we're just trying to break into the Inquisitors, edifice. Oh my gosh, words are hard, man. What can I tell you? I need more synonyms. It's not a building. Foundry. I don't know. I'll call it foundry. Engineering building. Whatever. And yeah, so we're just going to end up trying to go in through the pipes. Now, this is going to be another one of those issues where, once again, Captain Titus, how is he still wandering around carrying, this super terrible item? And we don't really get an answer for it. And I did mention before, how Psychers generally go before the Emperor, and then they get, their eyes essentially blazed out of their skull, and so they're mostly blind. Space Marines don't really work that way. If I recall correctly, when it comes to Librarians, who are the Psychers for Space Marines, they do have help. They do have, there are specialized pieces of armors, kind of like halos, that can get attached. I can't remember what the precise term for them are, but helps them channel their warp powers so that, they can learn to use the forces themselves to then, use their psychic powers. And there's a lot of training put into Space Marines because, again, their wills are trained a lot better. There's a lot of conditioning that goes into becoming a Space Marine, so they're not as susceptible to the warp and all that. So it's kind of odd here how, again, especially with Leandros is the young hotshot in our squad who yells heresy a lot. Heresy! But, I assumed what they wanted to do with Captain Titus here, also, oh wow, I almost died there. I assumed what they wanted to do with him was essentially have him end up becoming a librarian, so that way if the sequel happened, they could give him, psychic powers, which would be a lot of fun to have. But they just don't really end up dealing with it well, especially because, again, if the Inquisition... The very fact that he surrenders to the Inquisition, spoilers, is a bit of a problem. But, But yeah, it doesn't go anywhere, because again, they never made a sequel. So I think that's what they wanted to do with him in regards to this warp thing. It's not him being corrupted by the warp. The warp flowing through someone doesn't necessarily mean that they've turned to chaos or anything like that. If you have the training and the opportunity, you can quite easily learn to channel your powers properly. The Salamander novels, I can't remember what the main character's name is. I think it's like Drakir. Starts off by just, coming into his psychic powers. It's not, something evil. If you don't have training or anything, then yeah, it's very easy to fall to the warp, which is why the Inquisition works very hard to make sure that regular humans, who show any signs of potential power, get brought in, get captured and essentially brought to training, or to be fed to the Emperor. But yeah, when it comes to Space Marines, that's not the case. As soon as he shows any types of power or even his toleration for the warp, essentially their librarian cast should be coming in and saying, well, we're going to evaluate you, we're going to make sure that there's no chaos corruption within you, and then we'll train you to be a librarian. And that's kind of a thread in this game that just, nothing happens to it, nothing happens with it. It's just kind of given away. I will notice that there is one other type of person who ends up dealing with warp stuff that you just don't see very often because it's just, there's nothing you can do with it. And that is blanks. Now, they are super duper 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 uncommon. They're super rare. As far as I'm aware, there's only the one series that actually involves blanks, and that is the Caiaphas Cain series. Caiaphas Cain's Aide Gunner Jurgen, Gunner First Class, or Private First Gunner First Class, I don't know, something like that. Jurgen is actually a blank, and what that means is that he is essentially he's dead to the warp. If once again, I remember I talked about that one item that was found, which if you touch it, it essentially kills you. However, if you end up touching it and you have some warp capability, it will just enhance your powers or give you, really strong powers. If he touches it, nothing happens. The device just doesn't work. He is dead to the warp. The warp just cannot do anything to him. And so, for instance, if a demon is trying to manifest itself in the world and he walks up beside it, it will just disappear and be gone because it cannot maintain its body because there's no warp powers around him. And he essentially puts out like a mass dampening field for any warp powers whatsoever. So, for example, if Jurgen came up here to this device and pretty much held it in his hands, for all we know, the device itself could just die. Not explode or anything, because the warp would just disappear from it, and there'd be nothing left. Now, obviously, that's not the case, because once again, like with Titus here, the device still does everything it does. It's just, the only thing that's happening is that he shows a resistance to the warp, which could mean that he has the ability for powers, or does not. Again, it stays vague, they never answer it. You're never going to get an answer from it. Which is a bit of an unfortunate thing, but what can you do? Also, oh my god, squigs. I do like the fact that they added squigs into this. They're those little round guys who have explosives on them that essentially suicide bomb themselves into you. Now, as far as I'm aware, and it could have changed, the one thing I will say is that Warhammer 40k is always changing. If I say something and I think it's right, or it could have been right, 5 years ago, I could be wrong nowadays. It's always malleable, it's always changing. But squigs were generally only in Warhammer Fantasy. I've never once seen them in 40k. There are no squigs in Dawn of War. As far as I was aware last time I checked miniatures, which I will admit was years ago, there were no orc squigs. But squigs have always been a part of the orcs themselves. They're just, they're a fun thing to have. It's always fun to have more monsters in the game. Also, oh my gosh, wow, that rocket blast, just so dangerous. Please don't kill me. I will say it's a slight annoyance when it comes to the rockets, especially because it seems like they can sometimes just clip through buildings or like through walls, which becomes a bit of an annoyance. But what can you do? Please, please leave me alone. I have a las cannon and I know how to use it. Ha, suckers. What I will say about orcs, which once again, there's never really a consensus. Well, I mean, there kind of is a consensus nowadays, but back in the day it was kind of like, where do the orcs come from? Nobody knows. Some people say, this thing or that thing, and if you read Goblin Slayer, goblins come from the moon. But Goblin Slayer, FYI, is a manga and an anime. It's not actually Warhammer 40k related. But yeah, so what's essentially given is that orcs themselves, they spread from spores. So when you kill them and then they start, decomposing, they go into spores and the spores spread, and then they essentially, get lodged in the earth, and then the orcs literally pop out of the ground. They just get made. They grow and they pop out of the ground, and there you have it. So there, because of that, it's kind of like that thing where way back in the before times, when it came to pigs, like, oh, don't eat pork. It's dirty and it will kill you. It was just wrong information, or not wrong information. It's the result is, or the conclusion that is made is wrong, but it's based off of smart information, which was pork at the time held certain parasites that could then harm humans, and therefore don't eat pigs. They forgot the parasite bit, and so they just became don't eat pigs, they're dirty. Here it's generally if you kill orcs, burn the bodies. Not because they know that the orcs will spread through spores, because why would such scholarly information be given to your regular Imperial Guardsmen, but rather it's just over time they realize, hey, if you burn the bodies, there's less of a resurgence of orcs, because it turns out that any planet that gets invaded with orcs always has a problem with more tribes of orcs popping up here and there. So it's really hard, once orcs have established themselves on your planet, to get rid of them. The big one, again, as I mentioned earlier, is the Valhallans. They live on ice planets, or their planet is an ice planet, and they have an intense hatred of orcs because orcs came to their planet many, many, many years ago, like decades or centuries ago, and so it's their main nemesis is orcs, so they just love going out and killing orcs. And they pretty much just have a whole bunch of essentially folk knowledge about how to deal with orcs properly and make sure that they won't spread. The big one being, make sure you burn the bodies. Now the Valhallans are actually lucky that they live on an ice world, because once again, the world is a frozen wasteland, and there isn't much in terms of earth or anything like that. So any spores that existed really can't grow, because they can't lodge themselves into the earth and then grow a whole new tribe of orcs. There's actually an entire Imperial Guard novel, because of course there's a novel for everything, where it actually jumps between a newly established orc tribe and the Imperial Guardsmen who are trying to kill them, and by I mean all the orcs, and it goes through the entire thing of the orc popping out of the ground, being essentially spoken to by Gork and Mork, the gods, and then establishing his tribe and taking over starting to take over the planet. We don't know. It ends before they take over the planet, obviously, because it's supposed to be from the perspective of the Imperial Guardsmen, but it ends up with the Imperial Guard unit essentially being destroyed. I think there are 2 survivors in that novel, and it's actually quite a sad novel if we're going to be into it. As we mentioned earlier, there are, well, I don't know if I have mentioned it earlier, but the Inquisition is kind of their own little organization, obviously. And what that means is that they run all of their things themselves. So they have their own military, they have all their own branches for everything. And so obviously they have their own, inquisitorial shock troops. And what ended up happening was okay, I'm gonna have to go back just a teeny bit for this, because it's a bit complicated, and it has nothing to do with this, but it's an interesting story, and I figured I'm here to share stories. So a newly established Imperial Guard regiment, I'm just gonna call them regiments, goes down onto this planet in order to fight the Orks. Now, unfortunately, one of the officers who's associated with this regiment is deemed a traitor, and he's, scarred for life, and he's drunk all the time, and he's just a waste of space and terrible. And then he also has a guy who's just watching him over his shoulder and pretty much just, trying to hang out with him and keep him going and whatnot. And it turns out that this officer who's drunk off his mind and is essentially given up on everything, he doesn't care about anything, was part of a regiment on a different planet that was being forced into the meat grinder, essentially. So they had to assault a fixed position, and they were guaranteed going to be killed. And there was a bunch of regiments all across, surrounding this fortress that they were going to have to charge in the morning. And every hour they were supposed to call in and say, we're ready, we're ready, we're ready. Except obviously the Imperial Guardsmen did not like this. They were like, this is stupid, we're all going to die, this is a waste, we're not going to do this. So they all revolted and committed a huge mutiny. And so as the night progresses and, he's calling in on his phone to tell the high command that he's ready, all the other phones are going dark one after another as the soldiers rise up and essentially kill their officers because they refused to run up this hill to their death. And he's laying awake all night just waiting for them to come in and kill him. And then it gets to the time for the attack, and he walks outside, and all of his soldiers are standing outside, and they're like, "We're ready, sir. We are ready to assault this position." Now remember, this was supposed to be a large push, essentially a meat grinder, but it was supposed to be a large push with a lot of different regiments involved, and every single regiment aside from his had given up and mutinied. But orders are orders, so this one regiment by themselves ended up running up this hill, and they just all died. So he watched his entire, he was the commander, so he wasn't going up. But every single one of his units ran up and died. And he was devastated. So obviously the Inquisition got involved as this happened, this mass mutiny. And they, committed decimation, which is quite literally, killing 1 in every 10 soldiers. So they took them all and they just started killing them, and all the ones who didn't die, I believe, got put in a penal colony. And not good deaths either, old school deaths where they would tie them over, a Hydra battery and then fire off a round. So anyway, what ends up happening is the Inquisition is kind of sitting there and they're just like, well, what are we going to do with this guy? We don't really know. He followed his orders, he did everything he was supposed to, so we'll give him, this kind of cushy gig, but his spirit was broken, he had nothing left to give. And one of the inquisitorial soldiers, who was, just a part of the roundup and part of committing, the decimations and all this, he was just a regular guy, looked at the commander and was like, well, sirs as in the Inquisitors, I would really appreciate it if you sent me with him to watch his back, because I think he deserves that much at least. And the Inquisition agreed. See, they're not always bad guys. The thing, though, when it comes to Inquisitors and the Inquisition is that they can't risk any of their secrets getting out. So what they had to end up doing is they literally they removed his personality. They essentially blanked his mind, removed any knowledge and anything he ever knew, and gave him a fake personality, which was and then they put him into the regiment to follow this guy around. So what ends up happening at the very end is, in order to save, well, not so much save, but the commander ends up giving up his life, and he's like, screw this, I'm fine with myself now, and then he drops himself into the mound of orcs and dies. But yeah, there you go. There you have it. The Inquisition is evil, but not evil. And sad stories abounds. But yeah, so right now, sorry, it's been a while, we are breaking into the base, the Inquisitor's base, fighting off his turrets. Just be glad we don't have to fight any, servitors, because combat servitors, have huge chain blades, they have, high, they have melta guns, they have plasma cannons, they have the whole shebang. So pretty much this area is only just a bunch of turrets that we have to deal with. Nothing super scary, and we're just trying to get through in order to activate this giant weapon. Now, at this point in time, there should of course be absolutely no orcs. And we all know how long that's going to last, don't we? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You'll also notice that instead of the Imperial Aquila, or, you know, anything involving the Emperor, it's the machine cog, which, as I mentioned earlier, is essentially it's the symbol of the Emperor, but for, you know, the Mechanicum, and also, I believe, the Iron Hands and all that, because the Emperor is God, which is actually death by heresy, but that's okay. And what I mean by that is that back in, oh gosh, is it the 30k? I don't remember. I don't remember when the Horus Heresy went down, what year of the millennium that was. But when it started off, Earth and, you know, the forces of the Emperor were, you know, there was no room for religion. Now, the reason for that is because the Emperor saw that things like religion and the supernatural were paths that could lead and strengthen chaos. Because by remaining in ignorance and keeping humanity ignorant, it was possible to keep the warp and the forces of chaos at bay. Like, not forever, obviously, but, you know, it would keep them weak, because so long, if there's no one, if you don't know about chaos, you can't worship chaos. And so there was no worshipping, no nothing like that was what have you. Unfortunately, the Emperor, being the Emperor and being amazing and, you know, the most psychically gifted person of all time, who gave humanity space travel, who created the Primarchs, who created the Space Marines, who allowed the humanity to move forward and essentially conquer the universe, started to become being seen as, you know, a god. Now, that was actually really bad, because as we've already established, you know, that can lead to other things being worshipped and chaos. And more importantly, it really, really upset the Emperor. He hated it. He hated being seen as a god. He just wanted to be a man. I mean, granted, a huge man, a man who can do pretty much the impossible, and the strongest and most powerful man alive, but a man nonetheless. So he started just, you know, fighting with anyone, and he just outright was banning, you know, anyone worshipping him. Now, of course, that wouldn't last, and it still doesn't, and it's one of those things that's lost to history.
Very good, Captain. Your time carrying my power source is finally at an end.
But it's also one of those things which helped lead to the fall of the legions. Because I can't remember, I believe it was the, as I said earlier, I believe it was the Word Bearers who first started seeing him as a god, and I can't remember who the Primarch of the Word Bearers was. Was it? I honestly, I'm sorry, I can't remember. I want to say Angrath, but I'm pretty sure Angrath is the name of a planeswalker in Magic the Gathering. But yeah, but it was so bad, in fact, that as, you know, the one son of the Word Bearers, you know, they started passing along worshipping the Emperor essentially banished them and just didn't want to see them whatsoever. And then it progressed worse and worse, because as they had the Space Marines had their martial societies, they started having, you know, essentially their insider cults, their little covens of their, like, wolf warriors and all this, which then started getting, you know, crashed down on, and it, you know, led to the unrest and the fall of man and the Horus Heresy itself. So yeah, so X amount, 10,000 or however many thousand years later, we get to this point where the Emperor is essentially a vegetable on a chair, and it's just established that he is now a god. Which probably upsets him no end even now, and that's probably why he just eats a bunch of psychers. He's like, you know what, screw you guys, I'm gonna eat your brains. But yeah, as you notice here, we're on the point of no return. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I'm pretty sure I could return anytime I wanted, but whatever. I will say that it's quite nice how they add, you know, all the, you know, the votive strips and all that, because, as I mentioned earlier, with all the lost knowledge and how the Mechanicum works, we're now at a point where dealing with technology is almost as, you know, as spiritual as it is, you know, technical, which is why they constantly bless their stuff as much as, you know, working on it. Like, oh, what's this? Your tank has lost its tread. Well, we're gonna put a new tread on. Don't worry. but we're also going to spend 3 hours just reciting random scripture to it to make sure it'll keep working properly. Also, ooh, look at that sky. That's nice. Because if you aren't aware, we're firing off the weapon. The power source is now a weapon, and it fires it at there, right there. Boom. Right at the spire. Nice.
Look at the spire.
And it only killed my frame rate. Nice.
I've been looking for you, Space Marine.
And here's a bunch of orcs, including the Bork war boss.
Why didn't it work?
Damn that Drogon. Never trust the Inquisition.
Stand fast, Ultramarines. We can handle a few orcs.
Space Marine! Was that supposed to hurt?
Chaos demons! How is this possible?
You got new friends now, Space Marine! Inquisitor! Get back! How heroic. Drogon!
I have served you well, Lord Nimrod.
Traitor. I see. My servant did all that I hoped and more. But he would never have succeeded without you. Captain Titus. Thanks to these brave Space Marines, we have broken through to this reality. The blessed gateway. Clever fool. You seem surprisingly able to resist my touch, Titus of the Ultramarines. And that of the war, which impressed my servant to no end. Ah, you think the Inquisitor a traitor, but Drogon has been dead since before you first met.